start the recording. So that will be there for all of us. Thanks for introducing yourselves. I am recording the session, so you're going to be able to access that afterwards. Also, we will send a certificate of participation for anybody. We'll just send it automatically to those who are here, and with whatever name you registered with. So if you want your certificate to read something other than what you told us you were, then you can just type that into the chat window. And we're a very small group today, so hopefully we can have some interaction. I've enabled people's microphones. If you want to participate that way, please feel free to do so. But otherwise, I'll also be monitoring the chat window, and you can make comments and ask questions and things that way. Hopefully, each of you received a copy of the slides that I emailed yesterday. I sent one to each of you. If not, you might want to look in your spam folder. Sometimes, there's like a little magnet in the spam folder that attracts certain kinds of things. But I will also can send one after today's session. So we'll make sure that everybody gets that. So here's what I have planned for today, and I want to apologize if there's a little bit of a glare on the slides. I've been having I love this background because it looks like neurons to me on the sides, but looks a little funky when I put it into this platform. So, but here's what we're going to do today, really focusing on some brain-related topics that I find teachers seem to find immediately useful and relevant. So we're going to start there, but I'm also happy to answer other questions. These are my favorite thing in the world to talk about. It's fascinating to me how brains learn, and so I'm always happy to engage in that conversation. So today we're going to take a little peek into the brain, just enough brain anatomy to make the principles make sense, and then we're going to focus on learning and memory and types of memory and attention. So that's sort of the game plan. This is a picture of a brain, of course. It's an autopsy brain, and what we're seeing here is the folded outer layer called the cortex. Cortex derives from the Latin word for bark, so it's the outside, like the bark of a tree. It's not too thick, 1/4 of an inch or less, maybe 1/32 of an inch, somewhere in that range. And if you took it out of your head and flattened it all out, it would be about the size of a pillowcase. And it accounts for a good deal of the brain's weight. And this is where all of our thinking and all of our control of everything else happens. And so when you're looking at this, the cortex, it's what most people are referring to for the most part as gray matter, because it looks mostly gray. Unfortunately, we can't tell a lot about the brain and its function just from this, so we need to dig in a little bit more. We start to get a little more insight when we understand that parts of the brain specialize. Neuroscientists have divided each side of our brain into 4 lobes, and these in turn are broken down into some other structures. But our frontal lobes, which you can see, they're not this color in our head, they're like that gray, but this highlights them so we can sort of see where they are. And the front of the head, of course, is to the left-hand side of your screen, and the occipital lobe on the back is the back part of your brain on the right-hand side. The frontal lobes are responsible for most of the things that we think about when we think about thinking. Consciousness, critical thinking, problem solving, impulse control, our self-regulation, expressive speech, where we plan for the future, all that wonderful stuff. And behind the frontal lobes are the parietal lobes, which are responsible for touch and pain, temperature, and also seem to have a role in our ability to compute things and to write. So calculations and writing are aided by the parietal lobes. The occipital lobes at the back, of course, are where our vision is processed, and through all the information that comes in through our eyes or that we visualize in our mind creates those patterns there. And then the temporal lobes on the side are where we process a lot of hearing, auditory processing, and language. So while our brains do specialize, of course, they don't really operate, none of these lobes operate independently. These are not little mini brains. They all have to work together constantly in a very integrated and coordinated system. When I mentioned before that there are two sides of the brains, of course, these are what the neuroscientists refer to as hemispheres. And there's been a lot of misinformation, neuromyths we might call them, about the two sides of our brain and what that really means. So one neuromyth that people, I hope, are finally getting over to some degree is that, and because the two sides of our brain, again, don't operate independently. So people are not right-brained and they're not left-brained. We have to use both sides of our brains together. Everybody uses both sides of their brain together, and there's no advantage to pretending that students only have half a brain. Our students are not right-brained or left-brained. They have a whole brain, and we need to teach to the whole brain. So how do we know what different parts of the brain do? This is some interesting stuff. Until the advent of modern-day brain scans, it was from people like Tan. And this is Tan's brain, the picture that we're seeing on this slide. And here is Tan's story. Paul Broca was a 19th century French neuroscientist who studied a disorder called aphasia. And that means difficulty producing speech. And one day, they brought him a young man named Tan. And this young man was called Tan because Tan was the only word he could produce. So Dr. Broca interviewed him and evaluated him. And it was clear to him that Tan understood what he was saying, but was not able to respond, was not able to produce speech, even though he seemed to understand what he wanted to produce. The only sound that could come out of his mouth was Tan. Unfortunately, this young man died a few days after Dr. Broca examined him. But fortunately, Dr. Broca was able to autopsy his brain, and this is what he found. Now, if you're thinking that compared to that first slide that we showed that looks like there's a big indentation or a wound or something like that, that is in fact what Dr. Broca found. Either some trauma or a stroke had killed a large number of brain cells in the left side near the front of Tan's brain. And Broca wondered if this might be responsible for his inability to speak. Looks like a pretty severe injury. And what he did is he went back and examined the brains of some of the other patients that he had had with this same type of aphasia, and he found very similar injuries. So today we call this Broca's area, and it's one of the main areas responsible for our ability to produce speech. So that is originally how we sort of learned what parts of brains do. Today we get able to get even more fascinating information about where activity happens in the brain through the use of a variety of different kinds of brain scans. These are examples of a PET scan where we can see which parts of the brain are more active. And again, in this diagram, the front of the brain is on the left and the back of the brain is on the right. The white line is just drawn in, so that's not really. And what you're seeing is the areas of highest activity are the red and yellow and white areas. The areas of less activity are the green and purple and blue areas. Now, I guess we'll come back to that in a second. So when it lights up, we can see that activity. So if we look at the top left image, this is an image of somebody passively viewing words. And you can see that the back part of the brain is lit up, our occipital lobe, the visual processing area. And so that makes great sense. That's where we would expect to see activity if we're just looking at words. If we're listening to words, the activity is no longer in the back of our brain. Of course, we wouldn't expect that because we're not actively processing visual information. Now we're actively processing auditory information, and so that's going to happen in our temporal lobes. The if you look at us speaking words, of course, that is going to move the activity up more towards the back part of our frontal lobes, which is our motor cortex, where we actually control all of the motor activity in our bodies. And then you can see, interestingly, when we start to generate verbs, that we have to employ two different areas. And one of them, if you remember the picture of Tan's brain, is going to overlap very nicely with that area that Tan was missing in his brain, which is Broca's area. The other one actually happens to be Wernicke's area, which is an area that is responsible for our mental dictionary, the words in our vocabulary that we know. So we're using both of those together. Now, I do want to mention that just because it looks like there are parts of the brain that are not doing anything, that actually isn't the case. It doesn't mean that those parts of our brain are just completely inactive. It just means that the parts of the brain that are more active doing these activities are the ones that are highlighted. So we can see which parts of the brain are working on doing these particular activities. But what does that really look like in the brain? And what is happening when we're thinking or when we're learning? So this image of the brain getting wired by an electrician is a fanciful way of making the point that our brains actually do work through connections that are a lot like electric connections in some ways. Although, of course, the wiring in our brains is what our brains build themselves, as we'll find. There's no electrician, obviously, connecting things up. There might be a couple of dozen connections here, but the number of connections in our brain is much, much higher. Our brains contain 100 billion or so neurons, the cells that connect up, and we'll talk more about that. And those can make trillions and trillions of connections. And all of these connections are actually built by experience, as a result of the experiences that we have. So the cells in our brain that communicate are called neurons, and this is a diagram of three of them. You can see that each neuron has a nucleus. It's represented by that little black circle in the center and has one axon. The axon is the part of the neuron that carries electrical and chemical signals out to other neurons. The dendrites are the part of the neuron that receive the messages. So where an axon and a dendrite connects up, that's where this communication happens. Each neuron has about an average of 6,000 dendrites and just one axon. So the dendrites, which comes from the Greek word for tree, they're like the branches that branch out, and we talk about neurons growing more dendrites and more ways to connect to other neurons. In fact, the neurons are so dense that they account for about 90% of the surface area of the neuron. So what one neuron does is it sends an electrical signal down the axon, and the space between the axon and the dendrite of the other neuron is called the synapse. So when the electrical signal gets down to the end of the axon, it causes the release of chemicals called neurotransmitters into the synapse, and that's actually how they communicate with each other. So all of this activity multiplied by tons and tons and tons of neurons is really what's responsible for all human behavior, those connections among those neurons and their ability to communicate with each other. So what exactly does this mean for teachers? Since we obviously can't see inside our students' brains, and those neurons are microscopic anyway, so we wouldn't be able to see them connecting. And I apologize again for the little bit of glare, but hopefully you can read this okay. It's important because the creation of connections among the neurons is, in fact, learning. The brain is a learning machine. It builds itself through interaction with the outside environment to create and strengthen these connections among the neurons into neural networks. And the connections that are used the most and become the strongest are the ones that stick around, and the ones that don't get strengthened or don't get activated are the ones that are going to disappear. So when a group of neurons is activated together, it is more likely that activating one of those neurons is going to activate the whole rest of that neural network. And the more that we activate a group of neurons or a neural network, the stronger that tendency is. And that's what neuroscientists mean when they say that neurons that fire together wire together. So they're not wired together with wire, but they're actually wired together by the strength of those connections in those synapses and the propensity then to reactivate together. So the more we work those networks, the stronger the connections and the easier it is to get that network to reactivate. In a very real sense, our brains become what our brains do. So our job as teachers is to help students' brains build those really strong connections so that when they need that information, it is easier to reactivate it, because memory is the ability to reconstruct or to reactivate that set of neurons, that group of neurons in that network that were originally involved in the and welcome to Judy and to Sharon as well. So we're very glad that you were able to join us. This is a picture, an actual image of a slide of brain tissue enlarged many, many times. 30,000 neurons would fit on the head of a pin. And you can see the little black dots are the cell bodies. And then all the rest of that is that profusion of dendrites that are connecting together with and connecting those neurons. And these are actually layers of the cortex. The cortex has 6 layers with cells that communicate up and down all throughout the layers. And just imagine all of these neurons activating, transmitting signals electrically and chemically over and over again to activate other neurons. And there, of course, there's a lot going on in our brains. But your brain did not start off with all those connections. This is a mature brain that we're looking at here. This is more what it looks like when we were little bitty. So these 2 images of brain tissue, the one on the left-hand side is that of a newborn, and the one on the right-hand side is the brain tissue of a 2-year-old. And you can see the cells and their axons and some of their dendrites, but there are not nearly as many of them. And what happens is that at birth we start off with 100 billion neurons. Of course, we end up with about 100 billion neurons as well. And the brain weighs about a pound typically at birth on average. But from the time that those first neurons are created in utero up until age 2, the cortex creates about 1.8 synapses, about almost 2 of those connections between an axon and a dendrite per second, from the time we're still in the womb until age 2. So by the time we get to that point, our brain has grown significantly. By 1 year, the brain has doubled in size. By 5 or 6, it's 90% of its adult weight. And it's helpful, I think, and important to understand that what's happening here is not that the brain is creating more neurons, it's that the brain is creating more connections. It's those trillions of connections among those 100 billion neurons that accounts for that growth. And this is a picture of learning, that profusion of connections, and then ultimately some of them will get pruned if they're not used. But this is truly a picture of learning. Neurons from different networks in the brains react to the experiences that we're having, allow us to see, allow us to hear, talk, walk, grasp, all those things we do when we're little, and then eventually to run and talk and write and teach and everything else that we do in life. So I want to sort of pause just for a second and make sure that we're tracking and connecting back to why we're talking about brains at a cellular level. So the importance for teachers. Teachers don't transmit knowledge and understanding to students. As we've seen, brains build themselves. Brains have to create those connections. And each student's brain has to construct knowledge and understanding and capability and skills from the experiences that they have. So that the experiences that we create as teachers for our students actually physically change their brains. It also changes the teachers' brains, by the way, because everything we do does that. Our brains become what our brains do. And so I think this is something that often changes the perspective of teachers when they understand that this is the case. If you think of other implications for this, please share them with us, and as we go along, and we will be collecting, and I will be assembling all of these information that we're sharing together today, and I will be sending it out later, either with the slides or at another time, depending on how much there is. But please go ahead. I'll give you just a moment to share if you are so inclined. And again, if you want to ask a question, please do that as well. And Kathleen, the email would have come from bhill@mybrainware.com that I sent out yesterday, but I will send another one. And if you could also then maybe whitelist our exactly, information has to be repeated. Exactly. Great idea, Kathleen. New experiences. In fact, that's one of the things that we're going to really explore next, is sort of what we do when we're trying to teach students new information. So think about for a moment something that you want to teach your students that they don't know about. Just a new topic that you want to introduce them. You don't need to type it in or anything, but just have that in your mind. And now that you know that you just can't put information into their brains, that their brains have to construct it, we're going to talk about what has to happen to get our students' brains to make and strengthen these connections so that they can be later reactivated. So one of the things that we know is that when the brain encounters something it already knows, the relevant neural network is there and it's activated, and so we recognize that. That's a pattern that we look for meaningful patterns, and when we recognize something, we say, there it is. So our brains are powerful pattern recognition machines, and they're also very powerful learning machines. But what do we do when we haven't encountered something before? Basically, what we have to do is we have to find a way to make that new information meaningful, to relate it either to something we already know, and if not, that information is just going to be dropped. And here's an example. So if you take a look at this picture, if some of you have heard me present before, you may have seen it, or you may have seen this in something else. But if you look at this picture, just think about what you see. You don't have to type it in or anything like that, but just think about what you see. So as you look at this picture, do you see a dog? Well, how about now with the outline around it? It is a picture of a Dalmatian dog, but if you thought something else, you weren't really wrong. Your brain recognized a pattern that was familiar to you as that thing. And the point is that when we see things we're familiar with that match up with our models of that we have of the world, then we know what it was. So what if you came from a planet, however, that had no dog? Would you see a dog? Of course not. And in fact, I'll tell a funny story. When I was a little girl, my parents took me to for some reason, they were going over to my dad's boss's house, and I went along. And we walked in the door, and when we got there, and they had a very large dog. And I said, "Oh, Mommy, look at that cow." So, of course, today I distinguish perfectly well between a cow and a dog. But at that time, a big animal with 4 legs or whatever. Apparently, I encountered more pictures of cows than of dogs or something. And this reminds us that we don't always see the same things that everybody else sees. You don't always hear the same things that everybody else hears. So if you think about this in the context of school, what do you think? Do you think that you can do well in a test on information you have no understanding of? Well, here's a little example. So let's pretend we're in class, and now class, we're going to read this paragraph together, and then I'm going to give you an open book test. So this is called the montylation of traxylene. It is very important that you learn about traxylene. Traxylene is a new form of zyanter. It is montyled in serostana. The serostanians glycerate large amounts of FeVAN and then bracter it to causal traxylene. Traxylene may well be one of our most Lucas snilaus in the future because of our zyanter lessilage. Okay, now class, open book test. What is traxylene? Of course, traxylene is a new form of zyanter. And where is it montyled? If you had your mics open, you would of course tell me that it's montyled in serostana. And the serostanians, how do we causal traxylene? Well, we causal traxylene by glycerating large amounts of FeVAN and then bractering it. So we got 100%. We got perfect score on our test. But what kind of neural connections do you think we made in our brains? And if you said none, I think you would be on the right track. And I have to wonder sometimes, exactly, Charlotte, how much traxylene we're actually teaching kids, where we think we're communicating it or they're getting something and they're able to play it back, but really have nothing to connect it into, no neural network to connect it into. So if we want to make meaning, if we want it to truly be meaningful, then we have basically 2 options. We either have to find the experience that they've already had and hook the new information into it, or we have to create the experience with them. And let's take a little bit of an example of each thing, because here we start to look at some of the strategies and some of the approaches that can be effective in a classroom. So mind maps are a great way for students to connect information they already know to new information. These have become increasingly popular. I use a lot of them with all of my students because they help students build and connect their own neural networks. So this example of a mind map starts with the stages of human life from baby to adult, and then shows the life cycles of a frog, a chicken, and whatever that bottom thing is, a ladybug, I think, sort of as analogies to that, and ways to picture, to visualize, and to remember that. So there's nothing, there's no exactly single right way to do a mind map. Ideally, you won't create them for your students. If you're the one doing the work, you're the one that's building those neural connections. So it's great when you want to learn new material or understand it or connect it to information you already have, to draw a picture of it, to create an illustration or something like this. That's great. But of course, when your students are doing it, you want them to be building those networks, to be working with that information. Here's an example of creating an experience with them. When ratios are often sort of abstract, esoteric concepts for a lot of students, and something they may not have some direct experience with, at least on initial look. But there are lots of ways to give them real hands-on experience, field trips, acting things out, and any kind of simulation. And here's a hands-on experience or simulation or experiment or whatever you want to call it that can help with understanding ratios. I imagine most of you, many of you at least, have had the experience of making orange juice from orange juice concentrate that you buy frozen. And the ratio of cans of water to cans of concentrate is 3 to 1, obviously a ratio. The result is tasty and reinforces the idea that ratios can be very useful in real life. And then depending on the age of the student, you can build a lot more into this besides mixing them up. You might say, okay, well, maybe we should try a different ratio. What if we had a ratio where the cans of water to cans of concentrate was only 1-to-1? We can predict what that might taste like. It's going to taste really, really sweet and strong. What if we had 5 cans of water to 1 can of orange juice? It's going to be pretty yucky tasting because it's not going to have the flavor that we want it to have. And then you can think of having older students consider what would happen if we mix the results of those 2 steps. So if you took a pitcher with the 1-to-1 solution and a pitcher with the 5-to-1 solution and poured them all together, what would you get? So I don't know if we have any kitchen chemists or math teachers in our group today, but usually many people are able to figure this one out. And the answer, of course, is that you get a ratio of 6-to-2, which is 3-to-1, which is exactly the right ratio to create delicious orange juice. So far, I'm the one who's been doing most of the talking, and I know what that means for your neural networks and your learning. So what I'd like to do now is to have you pretend that someone new just joined the webinar, and I'd like you to enter into the chat window and just explain or reiterate a key point that they might have missed because they came late. Learning changes the physical structure of the brain. Yes, Thomas, thank you so much. That is very true, those neural connections. We need to connect material with students' lives and experiences, right? We need to hook into that existing neural network. Otherwise, that information is just dropped. It goes away. Create an experience they already know and create a new experience and create it with them so that they are physically involved. If someone had brought me to have a little experience with a dog, I think I might not have called it a cow. Okay, well, feel free to keep adding, and we will go ahead a little bit. We'll take one little more look back inside the brain. If you look underneath the cortex, we're going to find some brain structures that are really important in learning and memory. In fact, without them, as we will see, we wouldn't be able to remember pretty much anything at all, what we ate for breakfast, to say nothing of our lessons in school. And the 2 areas that I want to point out, one is the hippocampus, and you can see that towards just above the brainstem, a little bit in front of it. It's this long, sort of thin, people used to think it looked like a seahorse, which is why it's called the hippocampus. As hippo is the Greek word for horse. And also the amygdala, which is this little almond-shaped structure just in front of it. And the reason these are so important is that the amygdala is involved in emotions, and the hippocampus is very much involved in the creation of new memories. So first we're going to take on memory. We talked earlier about memory being the ability to reactivate neural networks that were previously activated. And that's true, but what it didn't take into account is that there are actually several different kinds of memory. When we take information from the outside world, it comes in through our senses. That information gets stored briefly, thousandths of a second, in sensory memory. And when we're exposed to far too much information coming into our senses to actually make anything of all of it. So at least 90% of what's coming in just gets dropped. It just gets discarded immediately, and we don't do anything more with it. If the information we're taking in has meaning for us, then we start to think about it consciously, and that process is called working memory. Working memory is basically when we hold information in our minds and manipulate it. If we don't rehearse that information or don't think about that information adequately in working memory, it will also be discarded and lost. And once it's gone, it's gone. It's not like it's somewhere there that you can, it's not like you actually took it in and it's stored somewhere, you just have to reactivate it. It's just gone. So only if we rehearse that information working memory can we have a hope that it's going to stick around. So what does adequate rehearsal really mean? Well, it's time for another story. This is a story, a picture of someone who was known for many, many years in the psychology literature as H.M. And his real name was Henry Molaison. And he just passed away a couple of years ago, so we now know his name. But when he was young, he suffered from epileptic seizures, and the condition was really debilitating, very severe. So when he was 27, the doctors decided that they could operate on the part and remove the part of his brain that was having seizures. And that part of Henry's brain was actually the hippocampus. Following the surgery, Henry's epilepsy issues were relieved, but he had a new problem. Well, he remembered things from his past, especially those several years before the surgery. He could not form new memories. He could not learn new words, songs, faces. He would forget you as soon as if you left the room and he came back in, you were a brand new person to him. There were researchers who worked with him for many years and saw him every day, but it was every day that person was a brand new person to Henry. So in contrast to that, however, interestingly, he was able to form new skills, motor skills. He might be get faster at drawing a path or a picture or a maze. He learned to use a walking frame when he had an ankle injury. So there were things, those kinds of things he was able to learn how to do, but creating other kinds of new memories. But for him, it was sort of like time had stopped. He could remember things up until a number of years before the surgery. He did have some retrograde amnesia as well. But pretty much the big issue was, and why he is so famous, is that removal of his hippocampus made it so that he could no longer create new memories. So this has led us to understand that there are really two completely distinct types of long-term memory. Declarative memory is one, and this is our knowledge for our experiences, recalling what we did, recalling a new person, all that kind of thing. And then procedural memory, which are those skills and habits like drawing, tracing a pattern, or walking, or riding a bike, or all those kinds of things that we practice to the point where they're automatic. And there are two different ways that we learn and store these kinds of memories. So procedural memory, again, basically you do something over and over and over again until your brain eventually says, oh, I know how to do that. No worries, I'll take care of it. And you don't have to think about it consciously. Driving a car, reading, typing, throwing a pass, all these kinds of things are procedural memory. And in fact, if you think about the fact, if you can remember when you learned to drive a car, many of us can, although we may not remember learning to walk, we can remember you had to think about everything at the beginning, the steering wheel and the rear view mirror and the gas pedal and the brake and all that. And now you'd probably drive to work and have no idea how you got there because, again, the brain will take on those repeated patterns and make them automatic. On the other hand, declarative memory is information about either semantics, our general knowledge, our knowledge of language and people and places and things that we can recognize even when they're in a different context. We recognize our best friend or our parent or whatever, even when we see them in a place that we've never seen them before. We know what words mean. Episodic is our life experiences. These are for what we had for breakfast, for what we did yesterday, for the things that all the irregular verbs in French, which I could maybe still be able to do, but those are the kinds of things that are part of declarative memory. So, for example, remembering when you first learned your multiplication tables is an example of episodic memory, but knowing that 7 times 8 is 56, which is a multiplication fact, is semantic memory, because we'll remember that irrespective of the context. And why this is so important to understand this distinction is that helping build those neural networks that make these skills stronger, these memories stronger and more permanent, requires 2 very different types of rehearsal. So for procedural memory, we want rote rehearsal. We want to do things repeatedly over and over again. If you think about practicing the piano or another instrument, if you think about running a play in sports, if you think about other kinds of skills like that, or how we build fluency in reading, all of those are examples of getting things stored in procedural memory, best done through repetition. On the other hand, declarative memory is not best developed through repetition, but through elaborative rehearsal. Elaborating or integrating information, giving it a hook to increase retention, creating chunks of reminders and things like that. The more we manipulate that, the better off we're going to be. So here we have some of the important characteristics of elaborative rehearsal. And all of this, of course, involves conscious processing in working memory in order to get the information stored in long-term memory. So first, students need to interact with the information to create a strong memory. And there are lots of ways we can do that in a classroom, and we're going to delve into a few strategies in just a minute that we can use. Multiple modalities are also important. So if information is only presented in one way, for example, by telling students, then the only way they really have to retrieve it is by accessing the auditory impression that they received. If we, on the other hand, arrange for students to experience something with multiple senses and in different ways, they're going to have many more ways to hook into that information and reactivate it. Real-world examples, that was something that Charlotte emphasized before. Relevance is a really strong motivator of attention. If students don't see the point of something or can't connect it to their lives, then they just, of course, tune it out, as you all know. Real-life examples make the information more vivid and therefore more memorable. And finally, linking new information to what students already know. So remember that picture of the Dalmatian dog. For students with no experience of a dog, we're going to have to create it for them. And that otherwise that picture just has no meaning. So here are some examples of some of the strategies that we can use to help students on that elaboration of declarative knowledge. Hopefully you will realize that I've already used some of these during today's workshop. So reciprocal or peer teaching. Remember just a few minutes ago I asked you to tell a key point to someone who might have joined us late. That's like peer teaching. Trying to explain something to someone else requires effortful recollection, reactivation of those neural networks, and means we have to understand it. Metaphor and analogy. That's how to compare something new to something that students already know. So, for example, when I talked about the dendrites on the axon being like branches of a tree, that's a metaphor and analogy depending how I stated it, and an example of that. Storytelling also helps bring things to life and make them much more vivid. And, of course, we've told some stories today. The story of Tan, the story of HM, and the story of my toddler self calling a dog a cow. Many good teachers use these strategies because they've learned to. Many do them instinctively. What we now know is that what's really happening is it's just giving students a variety of ways to interact, to elaborate, so that we can get that information into long-term memory. So again, we're going to stop just for a moment and connect what we've been talking about to why it's helpful. We want to end the teaching of Traxoline because it has no value and students won't remember it. So we can use strategies that help students remember more information over time. We have to help students make meaning for themselves. And if we want to teach students something they're not already familiar with, we need to hook that into what they've already done. If you have other things that are striking you, or that you're saying, okay, I see what this means for me and my teaching, or my colleagues and their teaching, feel free to add those again in the chat window. So we want to turn now. We actually sort of mentioned this briefly before. We talked about the fact that real life meaning is a very powerful motivator of attention, and so is, and very closely connected with this, is the role of emotions in learning. And I want to just spend a little time in our last 15 minutes or so talking about emotions. So whether or not the brain pays any attention to what's going on, and in fact, whether you remember things, it's highly dependent on emotion. There isn't really a lot of learning without emotion. Think about to yourself something that happened to you when you were in first or second grade. Most of us can remember something from the time we were 6 or 7 or 8. So think about that memory. I can confidently tell you that the memories you were thinking of definitely had some emotional content. I can predict that. If I'm wrong, you can enter it in. Give me a response in the chat window. And in fact, what we know is that they were more likely to be negative than positive. So just feel free to type in and let me know if that's true also. Think about how many things occurred to you in first grade, second grade, third grade that you don't remember. So that's your first clue to how important emotion is in learning. So I haven't had anybody tell me I was wrong yet in my prediction, but I need to look at it. Thomas says I'm correct. That's right. It's usually a pretty good prediction. And actually, you can use a lot of this with students too. I mean, the students are usually fascinated about learning how their brains work and understanding what they remember and why they remember it, and keying into how they can work to improve their own retention and of information. So we'll go back to this mental processing model a little bit, this memory processing model. We were talking about information getting stored in long-term memory, and we discard that. And to obviously have to be paying attention to it in the first place. And to make a little point about how attention works, I want to share a little video with you. And one of the things this platform does, and I tested it earlier, so it should work, is I've got a little video, a little YouTube video that I think is very, it's a good point, and it's also pretty entertaining. Oops, let's get back here. All right, so I'm going to hide that. I'm going to play a YouTube video. This is just a quick one. Play. Okay, let's go ahead and play it. Okay, that doesn't seem to be working. Let me, it should be able to work. Andy, are you on this call? Because for some reason I'm not able to play this video. If you are, maybe you could help me out. Okay. Do you know why when I'm trying to click on the play button for the to show a YouTube video, nothing's happening? Try uploading it again. Okay. Nope, it's just not working for me today. Okay, anyway. Okay, so we'll all be able to, yes, so the link is in the PowerPoint. Many of you may have heard of the gorilla video. Has anybody heard of the gorilla video? So basically, oh, is that Kathleen? Oh, no, there it is. Okay, we're actually going to be able to see it now. So I'm going to play the video.
Count how many times players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer, 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color for the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint here. So I have to tell you that I knew I'd seen this video. In fact, I've used it many times before. And when I came across this one, I did not see the curtain changing color, which makes just a point about what we're paying attention to, what gets through our attention filters is often not, it's certainly not everything. So what does help information get through those attention filters? Oh, that's the link. Things that are novel, things that are relevant, and things that have emotional content. And of course, we want to focus on the role of emotions here. So emotions are a double-edged sword. They can help or they can hamper learning. You probably already know this instinctively. Most teachers do, and all good teachers do, because you've probably been in those situations before. But we're going to talk about, explore this a little bit, and talk a little bit about the negative effects first. Learning situations can be stressful for many students. A couple of you have mentioned students who struggle with learning, and in those kinds of situations, learning can often be, classroom can be stressful. Will the teacher call on me? What if I say the wrong thing? This kind of situation causes a lot of things to go on physically in our bodies that we really have no control over. And we often refer to this as the fight or flight response. Our hearts beat faster, our skeletal muscles mobilize for flight, we sweat, our palms get clammy, and our cognition shuts down. So that front part of our brain is diminished in its ability to process things. And you literally can't think when you're in a fight or flight mode, or your thinking is certainly impaired. You think about a time that somebody insulted you and you couldn't think of anything to say at the time. Later, when you calm down, you thought, oh, here would have been the perfect retort, the perfect comeback. But of course, not at that particular time. So our classrooms and other learning environments have to be psychologically safe as well as physically safe. And there are a lot of things that you can do to do this. One of the techniques that I use, rather than calling on individual students and having them, potentially reveal that they don't know the answer or don't understand something, there's an online, some people use clickers. There's an online system called Socrative that I found very helpful. It allows you to poll or quiz the class and you can find out what each student knows and whether there's learning going on in general without embarrassing anybody or putting them on the spot. Again, let's now try to connect this to our own practice and what we do. What are some things that you do that you'd like to share with the group that help make the learning environment psychologically safe? So please feel free to type your ideas into the chat window, and we'll circulate those, of course, then with all the other input. Okay, well, hopefully you'll all add something. Repeat the expectations, right, so that students are familiar with it. It's not a surprise to them when they suddenly feel put on the spot. A peace corner in the classroom, Brian says. I'd love to know more about that. Probably gives them a chance to calm down and get over those feelings of stress. So that's so important to recognize that this is just something that happens. You can't say to someone, don't feel like that, because it's just how you feel. It's how you react to a situation. And that's outside of conscious control. But giving someone a chance to recoup and to gather their calm down, for their heart to stop racing, all that kind of thing. All right, but let's talk about the positive side for just a minute. And emotions are also important. We can't actually learn without emotions. And they add extra vividness to memories. So adrenaline, which is, of course, part of what's causing our heart to race, is actually not just a stress response. It can also be used for enhancing positive memories. So you want kids excited. You want them sitting on the edge of their seats. You want them curious about what's going to happen next and involved in it. And that kind of energy and engagement and positive emotion is going to stamp those memories and make them stronger. When you stamp a memory with emotion, motivational interest, you naturally engage adrenaline, and then you're going to get stronger memories. So let's, again, just underscore, I did that, I need to move the slide, there we go. Why it's important, of course. So hopefully we've talked about some ways to help students get students' attention and to keep it, using positive motivations to enhance the learning, and ways, we've had some very nice suggestions here, trying to make the learning fun, making accommodations to all, not just select who gets them. That's a really insightful suggestion, I think, Kathleen. Right, monitor teachers, you know, to your, you know, even making you aware of it, that that you don't need to raise your voice. In fact, sometimes practicing saying something even more quietly than usual is much more effective. So being conscious of it, obviously, is an important step. So based on what we've discussed today, the implications of what we've talked about and what we've done and the time that you've spent, if you leave this workshop and don't do anything with the information, you should be able now to predict what will happen. Hopefully it won't be like this. This is a little cartoon. Suddenly, without warning, Fred fell victim to the old adage, if you don't use it, you lose it. Hopefully you won't be like poor Fred here, and you'll actually will find some ways to use this information, to practice it, to teach others, to explain it, and that's what will help it become more permanent. So this has been a really brief introduction to some of the basics of the brain and how it functions and learns for teachers. Hopefully this has been helpful and useful to you. Please, I'm happy to answer some questions if you have them at this point, and of course later. You have my email, and I really look forward to connecting with each of you. Here again is my contact information, and would love to hear any questions that you have. Any specific websites with live examples of teachers putting this type of learning into practice? Let me think about that. I certainly know teachers who do. I'm trying to think if I know of videos that sort of capture that. That's a great question, Kathleen. I will definitely work on that. And as I said before, I will definitely be sending out copies of the PowerPoint to you, to everybody. If you don't have it by this time tomorrow, then email me. It just may be, and look in your spam folders also, because sometimes, as I said, there's a little magnet in those spam folders that just draws things into them. And, oh great, Sharon's going to use this with her early childhood teachers, because that's a time of a huge explosion of learning. It's a great time to understand that you can't just tell them something, that they have to really, it's not just hands-on. Sometimes we say, oh, we want to give kids hands-on experience. We want them to give them brains-on experience. We want to really have them engaged and working on authentic and exciting activities, because that's what's going to build those neuronal connections. So thank you very much, everybody, for spending some time with us today in the middle school. Yeah, I do have, Kathleen, some examples of middle school. We sort of, and middle school is a prime time for that, and for a lot of reasons, because of what's happening in terms of adolescent brain development, especially in those years. It's that's something that's really helpful to understand. And yes, absolutely. It's not just about hormones, although hormones do certainly play a role in it, but there's a lot of things that are happening in the brain at that time that, and if it's not relevant or it's not something that's exciting, it's your chances of getting through those attention filters are even less. So I will definitely send a couple of thoughts on to you on that. So again, look forward to continuing to connect with you all, and thank you again for joining us. And I look forward to, hopefully, we do have a series of other kinds of webinars related to various topics in neuroscience and education. Many of those there is no charge for, and so you will, get periodic notifications as some of those become available. And if there's a topic that's interesting, great. If there's something that you think is important to you, that you would like to see a webinar or a workshop on, please let me know, because we're always looking to help folks with information and practical application approaches that really help them. So thanks so much, and hope you have a great rest of the afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. And I will look forward to seeing you again online, or maybe in person. Who knows? Take care.